I was listening to Doug McGregor tell a story about when he was a cadet at West Point, and a guy later became, he's known as George of the Jungle, General Jalwan, and yeah, Larry knows who I'm talking about. He was a major back then, and he came in and discovered that they had a towel that was not properly folded. Think about that. He made an issue the fact that one of the cadets had not properly folded their towel. But his point to them was, gentlemen, details matter. If you don't get in the habit of paying attention to details and preparation and doing things properly, then when you're put into an actual real world situation that may involve combat, you revert to that which you've been trained to do. If you've been trained to ignore details, you're going to ignore some important details and probably get yourself killed. And that's, so this is, I'm not just taking cheap shots at, we weren't good at choreography for the, no, it's symptomatic. It reflects something, a bigger problem with the United States.
Nima, I'll add that General Bruce Clark, whom I came to know quite well, who was the real hero of the U.S. defense at Sanvith and defense against the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes in 44 and 45. Two armored armies, one Panzer Grenadier Army. Clark, when he was a four-star general, was what we call the Continental Army Command Commander. And he used to walk around military bases, and he would just look at a lieutenant who walked past a cigarette butt, walk over to the lieutenant and say, "Lieutenant, you see that cigarette butt down there? I don't see any privates around to pick it up. You probably should bend over and pick it up. If you don't, I will. But if I have to, you're going to get an ass chewing you like you've never had before." The smallest detail never escaped General Clark's attention. And that's what Larry's talking about. We don't do that anymore. Our generals don't even walk around looking for cigarette butts. I know that's just a metaphor for the fact that our generals are lost in their pursuit of a post-retirement job, 6 or 7 figures, and lost in politics at the top all the rest of the time that they're in uniform. We don't have a general in the United States Army, Nima, that I would follow to a shithouse.
Larry, you didn't mention the case of Venezuela. What's your take on that? We've seen a new footage that shows that 2 F-16 fighter jets flying directly over the USS Jason. And what's going on in the Caribbean Sea, and what do they want from Venezuela?
Well, let's separate out what we're being told, but then also raise the question of, is it true? I've had some suggest that what we're seeing was an AI generated image, but possibly. But here's what the story just doesn't make sense. Okay, so this is one of these fast boats. It's got 3 outboard motors on it, and they're going from Venezuela to America with drugs. How are you going to refuel those? Because those outboard motors are going to last. They can probably run for about an hour, maybe 2 hours. Then you're going to have more fuel. Well, I didn't see a tanker, oil tanker floating by to, pull up and give them, they could buy gas. And it's not like there are floating gas stations in the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico / Gulf of America. That's number one. Number two, the goal of drug trafficking is to move drugs, narcotics. You got 11 people on board the boat. There was no room for the drugs, So, and to label Maduro as some big cartel guy, it's complete. It's just nonsense. Look, my consulting firm, Berg Associates, we were at our height, we were 3 partners. My other 2 partners, one would have been the chief of international ops for DEA, and the other one ran undercover money laundering operations in New York City for DEA. And so we worked, our very first case was the Bank of New York Russian money laundering case. So we worked money laundering, drug trafficking cases. This is not how those cartels operate, by loading up a boat like that. That may have been the case in the 1980s with Miami Vice, but that's not the case today. But the broader issue, and the one that I find so disturbing, is this was an act of, if it happened, and if we really did kill those people, it's an act of murder. Yep. It's a crime. Look, if they're really drug trafficking and you spot the boat, the first thing you do is you try to stop it and board it. Now, if they start firing at you, if they start shooting at you, okay, then a rule of engagement would come into play, and you can fire back. It would be appropriate to fire back and kill them. But that's not what we had here. We saw zero evidence that boat was posing any kind of threat to the life of any U.S. military personnel or law enforcement personnel. None whatsoever. And yet we killed them first. Sorry, the other thing I did over the course of 23 years was script counterterrorism exercises for JSOC. And I never saw, out of 253 exercises that I was involved with scripting and executing, I never saw a single rule of engagement where Delta Force or SEAL Team 6 or our 75th Rangers were given permission to shoot unarmed people that hadn't fired on them. The ROE was always pretty strict. So this is like saying it's okay to go kill them just because we think they're bad. So the whole thing stinks. I think this is part of a broader the renewal of Trump's failed effort in his first term to replace Nicolas Maduro through a color revolution, and this is the next attempt at it to force him out and get control of Venezuelan oil.
Yeah,
Nima, let me just add that either Larry's right that this is a possible visual chimera, however you say that word. I've been schooled in how to say it recently. That was put together to scare other people who might challenge what we are saying about drug trafficking and so forth. Or, as Larry indicated, it's a complete and utter violation of international law, of domestic law, and of the rules of engagement that the military I served in always operated under. It's unconscionable to think they would have done something like that video depicts, because it is so illegal. And on top of all of that, it's unethical and immoral as hell. It is not in accordance with the way any military, let alone the empire's military, the American military, should be operating. And I agree with Larry that the whole way they painted it, the surface and the engines and the size of the boat and the number of people on the boat, did not comport with drug trafficking. I worked with the Cubans in the Mona Passage. I worked with the Coast Guard and the U.S. military that were down there liaisoning with the Cuban. And I don't know if it's changed miraculously, but they were really, in many cases, hard-pressed to catch the boats that actually carried drugs, because they were these huge, very fast, heavily fueled boats, cigarette boats, people called them in the jargon, that just raced at 90 knots across a relatively calm sea, and even 60 or 70 in a Sea State 3 or a Sea State 4C. So this is not, it just doesn't comport with and the other thing we encountered was these submarines they were building. They were small submarines, and there were only one or two people, and the rest was cocaine or whatever. And they were smuggling under the water, if you will, when they moved, showing their fear at that time we had really closed down on both the Pacific side and the Caribbean side of what might be called the U.S.'s 10 to 11% of interdiction. Well, guess what happened when we did that, by the way? You know where they moved? And one of my Marines pointed this out to the Atlantic Command commander when there was an Atlantic Command. We had a seminar down there. If you do that If you really close off and take 10 to 11%, which we have never achieved beyond, on both sides, Atlantic or Caribbean and Pacific, Gulf of Mexico and Pacific, then you're going to force it to go up the land in Mexico. That's what happened, and we contaminated the hell out of Mexico. That's what they did. So this whole drug war effort is a farce in many respects, and we are the ones who make it a farce. Yeah. This is not only farcical, but it's incomprehensible that we would have done this unless, like Larry said, it's just a fake video in order to scare people who might think it's real. That's all I can figure it might be. And let's face something else, too. I don't know that much about Trinagua, but as I understand it from people who do, and Larry maybe can comment on this, their main money-making enterprise is people trafficking, not drug trafficking. So were those people, if it did happen, if it actually happened, unconscionable though it is, if those people were killed and they were people being trafficked, holy mackerel, those are just innocent people who probably paid $2,500 US to get on that boat and make a little short trip around to another place where they get picked up by some other unconscionable people, taken to the Darien Gap or whatever, and flooded into the flow of traffic south to north. We're killing those kind of people? Well, Bibi's doing it in Gaza every single day, 5 times as many people. So is this the way we're going to wage war in the future? This is not a good development.
Yeah. Larry, yesterday we were talking, I was talking with Richard Wolff and Michael Hudson, and Michael Hudson came out with a very interesting idea on the boat. He said maybe they had Epstein files on the
boat. Yeah. I just, again, we're fed a story, and what is we become, to quote the Pink Floyd song, we've become comfortably numb to the government killing people. Let's remember, if Trump did, if this was really, they really did kill these folks on that boat. Trump's not the first one. Barack Obama did it to Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen. They killed his son too. Now, and it was justified. Oh, we think that they're a threat, or we don't like what they're saying. They didn't have a gun pointed at anybody, and they hadn't planted any bombs. But again, so this is we've grown to accept. George W. Bush could do it. Barack Obama could do it. Donald Trump could do it. Joe Biden could do it. It's okay. And Congress sits back and does nothing. This is the illegal use of force, in my view.
We had a very revealing argument in, I think it was late 2001. Maybe it was early 2000, might have been January 2002. And almost everyone in the security complex was involved, including many intelligence personnel, and including leading at INR at State. And we had it over this very thing, and we had it over tenants' desire. Even at that moment, we still were not sure we wanted to do it, to arm Predator. And now we have, Reapers, Predators. We have all manner of things out there that are silent killers and very lethal, very lethal. We predicted, some of us, that we would get to the point where these things were so usable, and in Obama's case, as Larry pointed out, so offshore, as it were, so far away, that they would grow into being the weapon of choice. And they would violate everything the Constitution stands for about the use of force and who authorizes it and who doesn't. And that they would lead to some killing that probably none of us in the ultimate future would like. And I think that's where we are now, to a certain extent. And when you get someone like Hegseth, who has no idea about what I'm talking about, but every idea about manhood and patriotism and Christianity and all the rest of the things he's advocating, you're doubly damned. And I think we're at that point.
Yeah. Larry, Putin had a press conference in China on Tuesday night, if I'm not mistaken, talking about the latest news, the latest things about Ukraine. What did he say to the press? What was the importance of what were the main points that he was trying to make?
Well, he made a variety of points. He didn't really say anything new. He just reiterated what has been Russia's position all along. He did get an interesting question about talking to Zelensky, and so he went through a very and this is not intended as an insult, but he went through a very lawyerly description and explanation of why it's useless to talk to Zelensky. And the first point he made, he says, look, the Constitution of Ukraine does state that you're not going to hold wars during or hold elections during war, and you can declare martial law. He says, but the Constitution doesn't say that a president who's elected to a 5-year term, at the end of their term, they can continue to serve until they have elections. He says their Constitution doesn't say that. What the Constitution said, I mean, it was really incredible. He's going through this explanation. Said what their Constitution does say is that at the end of that president's term, then the power reverts to the speaker. They're basically the Speaker of the House, or the head of the legislature, or the Rada. And he says, so, yeah, I'm happy to talk to Zelensky, but what's the point? Because he's not legally the president. His term has expired according to the Ukrainian Constitution. So, that was one of the points he made. He reacted as well to Frederick Merz, calling him the greatest war criminal of the modern era. And again, Putin doesn't take that stuff personally, and he doesn't feel compelled to go back and attack him. But he then went into an explanation. He says, look, we were one of 3 countries that signed an agreement back in January of 2014 to settle the Ukraine crisis when Yanukovych was in president. And he said, and what happened? The very next month in February, there was this bloody coup that was launched that killed lots of Ukrainians, and then unleashed the events that have put the special operation, led to the special military operation. So he says these countries have to be aware that they bear the responsibility for this, not us. We are responding and reacting to what they're doing. And he made it very clear, look, we'd like to get this settled peacefully, but if not, we're going to end it militarily, period. And so it was, like I said, he wasn't creating any news from the standpoint of saying something that hadn't been said before, but he was just making it, helping clarify that, yeah, I really did mean what I said in the past.
Using the phraseology, the greatest war criminal on the face of the earth, or whatever it was specifically.
Yeah.
Think about that for a minute. The man who fits that description is Bibi Netanyahu.
Exactly.
I mean, this doublespeak world would drive George Orwell nuts if he were still with us. Yeah. If it hadn't been in the Dirksen office building, if it hadn't been for Command Chief Master Sergeant Dennis Fritz and me and our presence to intervene between the Capitol Police and the Doctors Against Genocide when they first came into the building to meet with congressional members and talk with them about the genocide. These were doctors and nurses. The Capitol Police had their plastic handcuffs out, and they were going to arrest them. And we intervened, and we moved with them quickly into the offices of the congressman we were going to visit with, got them out of the limelight. And then we sent some pretty nasty emails to the general counsel and also the head of the Capitol Police. And we got some apologies back. But that's what we're doing now if there's no one there who knows the system a little bit to challenge it.
Israel wants to capture 83% or 88% of the West Bank, Larry. And a lot of, even UAE came out and talking that you're not going to do that. Because with the case of Abraham, of course, they're not going to have, The case of Abraham Accord is just removed from the scene if you do that. I would wonder if they're still talking behind the scene about the Abraham Accords that we're not aware of.
That I don't know. What is clear is that the crazed, the Zionist crazies, the settlers, they are intent on, confronting and taking the West Bank, and Trump is playing along with it. The fact that they prohibited, they banned all Palestinians, not just the Palestinian Authority from the United States, but they've banned all. Not gonna. They've made them all persona non grata, essentially. At least that's my understanding. And the killing keeps going on and on. So when I hear like someone from the United Arab Emirate or Jordan, the fact of the matter is there are things that countries, there are things that India, Russia, and China, for example, could do that I think would accelerate the end of this Zionist campaign. And that's just impose a complete, total embargo. No more trade with Israel. No more imports or exports. Shut them down. But they don't. No, nobody's doing. The only country doing anything of substance to try to stop Israel are the Houthis in Yemen. The only ones. Everybody else is just they talk a good game but do nothing.
What I've heard about the Abraham Accords, Nima, and Larry may have heard this too, is that the guy keeping them alive, so to speak, because the people know who's behind him, is Jared Kushner.
Yeah.
Well, you know what my general interpretation of the whole thing is? It's contrary to what John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt have said, though I think there's lots of truth in what they've said superficially. And I don't mean it's not important. It is important that Israel buys our Congress. But the real reason things are happening is because the neoconservatives, the globalists, as Doug McGregor calls them, other oligarchs behind the scenes, they want what's happening in the Levant. They want chaos there. They want ultimate chaos, if necessary, to bring down the regime in Tehran, for example. It's sort of an unfinished job. Then maybe they even want to go further than that. Think of the British, for example. You could rule the whole area if you bought the kings and queens. Well, now you kill the kings and queens. That's what it's all about. They're doing our dirty work in the Levant, and our dirty work is just as unstrategic, as stupid, as ignorant, as dumbly executed and conceived as all the rest of the things we're doing. Only in that region, somewhat like Ukraine, but I think to a more hideous extent, we're killing a lot of people. But we don't care. Lindsey Graham is a perfect example of that. If they weren't doing it, we'd have to be there doing it. That's almost a direct quote of Lindsey on the floor of the Senate. We like other people to do our killing for us now, partly because we can't do it ourselves. Our military is so broken. But also because it really conserves effort and money and blood, which sometimes can haunt you as a politician if you exhaust it too fast.
Larry, one of the countries that we didn't talk about in the summit was Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And you're looking at the Iranian media and what's going on within Iran, you understand how the public opinion, together with those main policymakers in Iran, are moving eastward. And it's amazing to me, even having the Pezeshkian administration, those people who are so willing to have a better relationship with the United States, they're just giving up on their mindset, on their policies, on the way that they were thinking of the United States.
To me, this is a colossal indication of how stupid we are. The Iranians, and you know this, Nima, the Iranians have tolerated the overthrow of Mossadegh. They have tolerated after that, the 26, 25 years of the Shah, the Savak, and all the rest that signified. They have tolerated all manner of Israeli perfidy. after Israeli cooperation, for example, in the Iraq-Iran war on both sides, and the same with us. They've tolerated all of that up to the present time when, as Larry said, it's going away, that they like the United States. I mean, through all of that, they bred a population that favored the United States, favored the West. Look back, if you will, on the time when we actually said and did what we meant about being anti-colonialists and so forth. We've destroyed that.
Yeah.
We have destroyed that. We have pushed them just as assuredly as we pushed Russia into a relationship with China and ultimately India. We have pushed Iran in. I don't think there are too many Iranians anymore who would have a positive thought about the United States of America. And that is a true tragedy, because they were one of the few people in that region who did, and who did it despite all of the things we did against them to destroy it. But now it's been destroyed, I think. I think Larry's right. They're looking the other way. And traditionally, you know this, Nima, historically, they have always feared the Russians. and the Chinese were too far away and too inconsequential at that time for them to have any real feelings about them. Now they're in their arms. I mean, they were very prominent there, as Larry said, at the SCO summit. And I'm sure they're going to be at subsequent ones. And we've lost them. We've lost the potential. And all of this I attribute to the clean break strategy, not the globalists so much as the neoconservatives, and the neoconservatives who still want the overthrow of the regime in Tehran, or they will be substantially angry. It's got to happen. It's got to happen. And they're allied, as I've said before, with 50 plus million dispensationalist / fundamentalist Christians who believe that's necessary to complete the destruction of the Levant so Jesus can come down again.
Yep.
Larry, the case of Europe, before wrapping up, I want to talk about the case of Europe. It's somehow complicated because Europe is dealing with the conflict in Ukraine, and they have sacrificed a lot during the war. And we have immigration, all these problems coming to Europe. But you see Elon Musk is somehow trying to picture Europe as they're raping Europe and all of these sort of rhetoric. Here is the statistic coming out of London. 88% of British rapists are white. And considering 82% of British people are white, out of 82%, 88% are, the crimes. And you go to the Asian countries, it includes India, Palestine, Bangladesh, China, and other countries.
Right.
It's 7%.
Well, facts are funny things. You get a narrative going, and then how dare you introduce facts and actual statistics? So again, I've been watching. I'm pleasantly surprised, or I shouldn't say pleasantly, but I hadn't seen those statistics. I'd heard the narrative about these Pakistani gangs raping all these girls, and that was the dominant primary activity going on right now. Then wait, 80 is basically the English guys, the natives. It's not any of the foreigners. Okay, so boy, there you go, ruin a perfectly good narrative with facts. and we've seen the same thing with respect to Iran. We're told, Iran's the number one sponsor of terrorism in the world. Absolutely not true. Hamas is this massive terrorist organization. Over 25 years, the Palestinians, it wasn't just Hamas, Palestinians were attributed to having killed or been responsible for the deaths of about 1,500 Israelis over a 25-year period. Hell, that's just one day for the Israeli occupation forces killing people in Gaza. So, like I said, these facts start weighing in. Europe is it is in an economic crisis, and it's in a political crisis. And the political crisis is there is no consensus. there's no majority party. All you got are these segments, and those. So you wind up with a minority government that has to go out and enlist other so-called allies, and you have to make concessions and you have to sell out your principles at that point. But the fact is that all of these European countries across the board do not have a strong majority, like was the case, 20 years ago. You could at least say the Labour Party was dominant in the UK, but now look what's happening with Labour. And just in a period of a year, 2 years, they have fallen so far out of favor that Nigel Farage's party has risen to the top. And so in the midst of this, their economies are indebted beyond, England's 100% debt to GDP. France is like 110. The claims are that the government's going to collapse Sunday or Monday in France, throwing it into a political and economic turmoil. Germany, their debt to GDP is like now 70, 79%, but it was 50% 3 years ago. So what's happened is as their economy's collapsing inward, they're having to go out and borrow more money. Yeah. And they are in a recession as well. So none of them are doing great economically. And yet, what are they all doing? Let's give billions of dollars to Ukraine. I mean,
5% of GDP.
Yeah.
Defense.
Yeah. It's just, it's totally irrational. So, I think this only ends with, with a car crash, an implosion of some sort.
Nima, another side of this, I got really rudely introduced to yesterday when you may have seen, was it said that Al Jazeera that did the really powerful 45-minute or so video on Mahmoud Abbas getting to Geneva, having the UNGA there, pretending his letter, getting a peace force and sending it to Gaza under Chapter 7 rules. In other words, ROE that says you can shoot. And this woman came in and she made a really good argument for how that wouldn't work because Mahmoud Abbas, and I admit this is true, is a crook and a filthy old man and so forth and so on. It has no interest of the Palestinians, only his own interest at heart. And any peacekeepers put in, the French, the Germans, the British, the Americans, or whatever, would be so freaking colonial that it would just be an aid to Netanyahu that was better than his own strategy, but it would do the same thing in the end. And the only thing I could come back and say to her was, you've got a point, but if they were Chinese troops, maybe Indian troops, maybe Turkish troops like we had in Somalia, who were Sevik Bir was our commander in Somalia. He's a pretty good guy, pretty good troops. Might be different because they wouldn't put up with that sort of thing. They would end the killing and make sure the Gazans were fed and watered and so forth. But that just shows you the angst and the ire that exists towards Europe, because that was who she was really talking about. That would be the real peacekeepers, the French, the Germans, and the British, and so forth. And that would be terrible, she said. And I admit it probably would be. It probably would be, because all we would do is put a patina of kindness on what, and humanitarianism on what would ultimately be the same thing, the extinguishing of the Palestinian state. She's right. But I do think I was right too. If you put other peacekeepers in there from this new world of morning, you might have a totally different situation. And I will bet you on a dime the IDF would not launch one round at a Chinese battalion.